There's a category of being that the Force simply does not acknowledge, not weak in it, not distant from it, but absent from it the way a sealed room is absent of air. A Jedi could stand among them and sense nothing, not the flicker of presence that marks even the least Force-sensitive soldier, not the dull weight of emotion the Order was trained to read across crowds. The tradition built on the belief that the Force moves through all living things had a category of living thing the Force refused to move through, and neither the Jedi nor the Sith ever fully explained why. Two species across the Old Republic era carried that silence. One built the largest empire the galaxy had ever seen, and the other nearly ended it. Both were walked around rather than walked into. Neither order tried to recruit them, nor did either tradition try to train them. And the reason was not policy, it was the wound itself. What does it take for the Force to cut a species off entirely? The Jedi and the Sith spent millennia studying these two species without answering that question. They wrote histories, they preserved artifacts, they looted ruins, and they built entire philosophies around the lessons they thought they had extracted. What neither tradition admitted across all those centuries was that the answer described them too. In 3956 BBY, a former Dark Lord returned to a world the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. Revan had conquered half the charted territories, been captured and stripped of his memories by the Jedi, and was now following a trail of clues to a planet called Lehon, a world the Republic star charts did not include. He found ruins there, ancient machines that no longer functioned, and temples built to a scale that dwarfed anything the Republic had ever produced. He also found two surviving factions of a species absent from every historical record he had ever read. When a warlord called the One observed Revan's abilities in the storyline of Knights of the Old Republic, he did not call them the Force. He called them strange magics, because he had no framework left for what he was seeing. The species he ruled had once been the most Force-sensitive beings in the galaxy, and that ignorance was the shape of what they had lost. Around 30,000 BBY, the Rakata Infinite Empire spanned over 500 worlds, with roughly 10 billion Rakata ruling over 1 trillion enslaved sentients. Wookiees, Selkath, and Duros were among the species it conquered. Every member of the species existed inside the Force as a biological baseline, not through training, but through nature itself, and they used that sensitivity to dominate everything they touched. They built a civilization that could not function without it. Every piece of their technology required Force sensitivity to operate, and this dependency shaped everything they built. Their hyperdrives could only navigate to worlds with strong Force signatures, which meant the Infinite Empire expanded exclusively along the lines of Force energy running through the galaxy. From this same principle came the Force Saber, the direct predecessor of the lightsaber, along with mind prisons capable of trapping consciousness indefinitely and terraforming engines powerful enough to reshape entire planets. At the center of it all sat the Starforge, a semi-living space station orbiting the star Abo that drew on stellar energy and the dark side of the Force to produce war supplies on a scale the galaxy had never seen. This is the detail the Jedi never sat with, because sitting with it would have meant looking in a mirror. The Rakata consumed the Force rather than working within it. The Starforge was a mouth that fed on Force energy and gave back fleets, weapons, and dominion. Their ships ate paths through the Force instead of traveling within it, and their civilization ran entirely at the Force's expense. Around 25,200 BBY, a plague swept through the species that most historians theorize was engineered by a conquered people exploiting the Rakata's self-imposed genetic uniformity. It did far more than end lives. A mutation within the disease stripped the Rakata of their connection to the Force entirely, and the process took generations rather than days. Families watched their children born without the sensitivity their parents had carried, while technology that had operated for thousands of years went dark one component at a time. Ships fell silent, the Starforge kept functioning autonomously in the Lehon system, but no Rakata could reach or command it anymore. Within a few generations, the Infinite Empire collapsed entirely, and the survivors devolved into tribal barbarism on their home world, eventually forgetting how to operate their own creations. The Jedi wrote this down as a warning about the corrupting influence, but the warning pointed somewhere else entirely. It was a warning about any civilization that built itself on the Force. The Rakata had constructed an empire that could not survive without Force access. Their authority rested on it, their weapons required it, and their infrastructure was a line of dependencies running back to the same single point. When that point was severed, the entire structure collapsed inside of a few generations. The species could not rebuild because the species had never built for a world without the Force in it. They had not planned for the possibility of being cut off because they had never considered that the Force could cut them off. Across the ages, the Jedi built an order with the same structural dependency. Their weapon required the Force to construct. Their training required the Force to complete, and their authority rested on Force access at its foundation. It was the same architecture. Their entire institutional existence was a line of dependencies running back to the same single point, and when that point was severed at the end of the Clone Wars, the Order collapsed inside a single afternoon. 900 years of accumulated knowledge, tradition, and political standing ended because the Force stopped being available to the beings who had built everything on top of it. The Jedi told the Rakata story as a warning about hubris, repeated it across generations, and never noticed they were reading about themselves. Bane studied the Rakata extensively, reading a text written by Revan during his time as Dark Lord while at the Academy on Korriban. Around 1000 BBY, he traveled to Lihan himself in search of Revan's holocron. By then, the species had gone extinct on their own home world. The Shadow Order preserved what they had left behind, studying Rakatan ruins, looting Rakatan artifacts, and treating the Infinite Empire as a model of what Force users could accomplish at full ambition. In the novel Darth Plagueis, the Muun Dark Lord presented to Sidious an account of the Celestials and the Rakata, ancient Force users who had moved planets, organized star systems, and conjured dark side devices like the Starforge as they saw fit. The Sith admired their audacity, but there was no one left to recruit. What both traditions inherited from the Rakata, they inherited without knowing it. The Rakatan word for emperor was Doretha. The etymology was first proposed in the in-universe article, Heritage of the Sith, and later restated in the reference Jedi vs. Sith, The Essential Guide to the Force. According to these sources, one proposed origin of the Sith title, Darth, is a corruption of this Rakatan word. The chain of transmission is not clean, and the etymology remains contested, but the evidence was strong enough that the tradition never fully dismissed it. Every Dark Lord who ever carried that title may have inherited it from a species they never recruited, never trained, and never restored. Bane traveled to Lihan, studied Rakatan ruins, and carried the word Darth as his title without ever knowing it was theirs first. The title did not vanish with them, and somewhere beyond the galaxy's edge, the second species was already moving. Palpatine was among the first in the known galaxy to learn of the Yuuzhan Vong, gathering intelligence decades before the invasion. By at least 27 BBY, the Emperor-in-Waiting had gathered intelligence on the Far Outsiders, a term coined by the Faroan settlers of Zonama Sikat, and used the threat of their coming invasion as one justification of keeping the Imperial military at wartime strength during peacetime. In the novel Outbound Flight, his agent Kinman Doriana documented the approaching threat for a young Chiss commander named Thrawn, describing ships and weapons of living organic material unlike anything the known galaxy had encountered. Sidious knew what was coming, and yet the man who had spent his entire life identifying and cultivating sources of power looked at the species approaching from beyond the galaxy's edge and concluded there was nothing there he could use. He was right about that, but not for the reason he thought. Long before they became the most feared invaders in living memory, the Yuuzhan Vong were a different species entirely. The Yuuzhan Vong lived in biological symbiosis with their sentient home world, Yuuzhan'tar, in a distant galaxy far beyond the borders of charted space. They were fully connected to the Force, and every living thing on their world existed in harmony through it, a relationship so deep that the planet itself was conscious. Yuuzhan'tar was something the known galaxy had no category for, a world that was alive in a way no other had ever been. Two terrible conflicts destroyed that relationship. The first was a war against rival droid civilizations that waged their conflict across the Vong's home galaxy, trapping the species in the middle. That war forged the Vong into organic supremacists who rejected all mechanical technology as blasphemy, turning every droid, every computer, and every piece of metal and wire technology into a religious abomination in their eyes. The second conflict was worse. Known as the Kremlivian War, it was a civil war fought between the Vong's own domains with such ferocity that it devastated much of their home galaxy. The living planet responded by severing the entire species from the Force. This is the part of the story that sets the Vong apart from every other severed species in memory. The severance was nothing like the Rakatan plague. The planet made a decision. The relationship had broken beyond repair, and the world that had held the species inside the Force chose to cut them loose. Within moments, the entire species was separated from the thing that had shaped them from the beginning. The Vong experienced agonizing pain as their connection was ripped away, a collective trauma so deep it reshaped their civilization from that moment forward. The Rakata had lost the Force slowly, and their descendants had forgotten what it was. Within a few generations, the One could look at Revan wielding abilities his own ancestors had possessed for 30,000 years and dismiss them as strange magics, because the memory had died with the civilization. The Yuuzhan Vong took the opposite path. They had not lost the Force to a virus or to time, but had been cut off by the world that loved them, and they had felt it happen. They remembered, and they built a religion around the loss. Their ritual scarification, their theology of torment, their veneration of gods who demanded sacrifice, all of it traced back to that moment. The last sensation the species had felt before the silence was agony. So agony became the only remaining path to the divine. They did not forget what they had lost. They built every waking hour of their civilization around it. Before Yuuzhan itself was destroyed in the aftermath of the Kremlivian War, the planet did one final thing. It released a seed into intergalactic space, which drifted across the void for thousands of years before taking root in the Gardaji rift of the Tingel Arm, becoming a living, sentient mobile world called Onimi. It hid there for 15,000 years. Only after Will of Tarkin's Imperial attack in 29 BBY did it flee to the unknown regions, carrying Yuuzhan's memory inside it. That seedling would not reveal its true purpose until the Vong had nearly destroyed this galaxy. Across generations, the Vong drifted through their own devastated galaxy, their religion hardening around the severance, their technology growing from living organisms, their warriors trained on the memory of a connection none of them had ever touched. By the time they reached the charted territories, the absence had had enough time to become a weapon. Beginning in 25 ABY and lasting 4 years, the Yuuzhan Vong War claimed an estimated 365 trillion lives. Coruscant itself fell temporarily to the invaders, and the entire species were driven to extinction. The Vong were unlike any enemy the galaxy had faced. Tall humanoid beings with gray skin and sloped foreheads. They modified their bodies extensively with living organic implants as a religious obligation. Their technology was biological through and through, which meant the galaxy faced an enemy whose every warship, weapon, and defensive countermeasure was alive. The Coral Skipper's Dovin Basil, a living gravitic organism, absorbed incoming fire into a miniature singularity rather than deflecting it. Amphistaffs rendered traditional lightsaber swordsmanship useless, and Dovin Basil's turned gravity itself into a shield. For the Jedi, this was as much a theological crisis as a military one. Luke Skywalker had built the new Jedi Order on the principle that the Force moves through all living things, and the Vong were unquestionably living things. They breathed, felt, bled, and died, and yet the Vong did not touch them. If the Order's basic teaching was true, the Vong should have been impossible. and yet they were on Coruscant. Vergere had spent over half a century inside a civilization the Force could not see, having disappeared from the Republic before the Clone Wars and lived among the Vong as something impossible to categorize. She was neither what the Jedi had trained, nor what the Sith had built, and the conclusion she reached, detailed in the novel Traitor, unsettled both traditions equally. The Force, she argued, did not have a light side and a dark side. It was all one thing. The distinctions the Jedi and the Shadow Order had fought wars over across the ages were artificial constructs imposed on a single energy. The Rakata had not been severed for choosing the corrupting influence. They had been severed because they weaponized their relationship with the Force until their relationship itself broke. The Vong wore the same pattern in a different form. Their severance came not from violence itself, but from what the violence had taken from them, the living world that had connected them to the Force. Both species had violated the bond, and the severance was about the relationship, not the doctrine. The Jedi adapted where they could. In the Edge of Victory duology, Anakin Solo replaced the crystal in his lightsaber with a lambent, a Vong bioluminescent organism whose living resonance could detect Vong presence where the Force was blind. He coined the term Vong Sense for the ability. After his death at Merkur, his brother Jacen Solo developed his own version through Vergere's tutelage, reading the absence the invaders left in the Force the way a tracker reads a footprint. The Force could not see the Vong, but it could see the shape of the void they made as they moved. No Vong was ever trained as a Jedi, and no Vong was ever handed a lightsaber. The Force was teaching the Order to see around the absence this species carried, and that was the only relationship it would allow. One Vong found the Force on his own, and what the Force did to him is the detail the entire story turns on. His name was Onimi, and he was born into the Shaper caste. The Vong were a rigidly caste-structured species, and their warriors lived by a code built around combat that led them to dismiss Force users as practitioners of heretical magic. Priests followed a theology of divine suffering and treated Force sensitivity as a rival theology rather than a power worth studying. Neither caste had any reason to investigate the Force as a mechanism, and the idea of reconnecting to it would have been unthinkable to both. Shapers were different. Their entire function was to modify living organisms and find out what biology could do under the right conditions. Watching Vong warriors fall against Jedi, a Shaper asked a different question than a warrior did. Where the warrior asked how to fight more effectively, Onimi asked what the mechanism behind Force use actually was, and whether it could be replicated. His caste was the only one in Vong civilization with the framework to even conceive of the experiment. He grafted Yamask tissue to his own brain, and the experiment worked. His connection to the Force was restored, but the process left him physically broken, twisting and deforming his body in ways Vong biology could not reconcile. Since deformity in their society meant divine rejection, Onimi was branded a shamed one, the lowest social stratum in Vong civilization, and used his restored Force powers to manipulate the future Supreme Overlord into taking him on as a familiar and court jester. No one in Shimra's inner circle paid attention to a crippled outcast in a fool's costume. That was the last mistake the species ever made. Onimi had dominated Shimra since around 29 BBY, orchestrating the coup against the previous Supreme Overlord, the decision to invade, and most of the war itself. The true architect of the Yuuzhan Vong invasion hid in plain sight, lurking in the court of the Supreme Ruler he controlled. The mind behind the fall of Coruscant and the deadliest conflict in recorded memory belonged to a crippled outcast in a jester's costume, though his control over Shimra began to slip in the war's final stages. And then, the Force answered. During the Battle of Yuzantar in 29 ABY, Luke Skywalker led a 3 Jedi strike team with Jacen and Jaina Solo and personally killed Shimra in direct combat, decapitating him with both his own lightsaber and Anakin Solo's. With the puppet gone, Onimi revealed himself. Jaina was knocked unconscious by Onimi's toxin, and Jacen Solo faced him alone. As they fought, the young Jedi achieved a state of complete unity with the Force, what the new Jedi Order would later call oneness. And the Force acted through Jacen not as a weapon, but as a correction. It reversed every deformity on Onimi's body, undid the damage the Shaper experiment had caused, and restored his physical form to what it would have been if he had never altered himself. Jacen's oneness severed Onimi's connection to the Force, the basis of his mastery of the art of the small, and without that control, the corrosive toxins he had been generating during the duel consumed him from within. He dissolved into a puddle of hydrocarbons. The Force did not embrace him. It did not welcome back a lost member of a severed species. It corrected him. It treated his reconnection as damage to be undone, walked his body backward through the modification that had allowed the experiment to work, and erased the conditions that had let him touch the Force again. What remained after the correction was a Vong whose own biology ended him, because the barrier could be broken, but the Force treated the result as a violation. The severance had never been about evil, it was about trust the Force had withdrawn and would not extend again. Onimi's experiment was not a path back for his species, it was a single outlaw crossing a border the Force had drawn, and the Force escorted him out the same way it had escorted his ancestors out, by taking back what he was not meant to carry. Neither the Jedi nor the Shadow Order could have trained a Vong into the Force, because the bond they would have been trying to restore had never belonged to them to give. Zonama Sikat revealed itself at last in the war's final stages. The living world that had drifted through intergalactic space for thousands of years, carrying Yuuzhan memory inside it, emerged not as a weapon, but as an offer. To the surviving Vong, it extended something neither tradition had ever attempted: the possibility of relationship again, not through training or doctrine or any temple or academy, but through the world that remembered them from before the wound. The Jedi could not restore the Vong's connection because the Jedi had never been the source of it. The Shadow Order could not restore it because the corrupting influence had never been the mechanism of its loss. What the Vong had lost was not a power, but a bond between a species and the living world that had shaped them. The path back, if it existed at all, would not pass through any institution that understood the Force as a tool. It would pass through the world that had severed them in the first place, because only that world had the authority to offer what it had once taken away. The Force remembered relationships, not doctrines. Both traditions had studied the Rakata and the Vong across generations and pulled from them the lessons they wanted to learn rather than the lessons actually written there. Bane carried the word Darth into history without knowing it was Rakatan. He never knew. The Jedi told the story of the Infinite Empire's fall as a warning about ambition, never noticing the warning applied to them. Palpatine looked at the Yuuzhan Vong approaching from beyond the galaxy's edge and saw no power he could use, without understanding that the reason he could not use them was the same reason his own title had been borrowed from a vanished people. Every institution built on the Force was reading a history that described its own future, and none of them noticed in time. The Force itself, the thing both traditions claimed to understand, had a category of severance neither tradition could reverse, a door that could be walked through only from one side, an absence that persisted not because the beings inside it were weak or fallen, but because the relationship had ended on terms the Force had decided were final. The Jedi recorded what they could, and the Shadow Order looted what they could. Neither ever asked the one question that would have changed what they thought they knew. What does it take for the Force to cut you off entirely? The answer was sitting in both their archives the whole time. The figure who first set foot on Lehon and carried the Rakata's secrets back into the tradition that would one day produce Palpatine had already lost himself before he ever found them. And his full story, from his rise to his fall and everything in between, is covered in its entirety on the channel. And the Yuuzhan Vong were not the only thing in the galaxy found waiting in the dark beyond its edge. What else is out there? What else has been watching the charted territories from the black between galaxies? Is the other story waiting for you next?